I don't. Uh, Filippo, you start. Sorry, I'm worried. I was. It sounds important. Sana? What do you think? No. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, you're very, very welcome to this, the fourth event in the IIEA's 2025 Development Matters Lecture Series, which is sponsored by Irish Aid, the Irish Government's Development Cooperation Programme. My name is David Donoghue. We're delighted to be joined today by Filippo Grandi, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. Filippo, you're very, very welcome. On this, I think your second visit to the Institute. The High Commissioner will speak to us for about 20 minutes or so, and then we will go to Q&A with our audience. For those of you in the room, please feel free to raise your hand afterwards in that session if you have a question, and we'll come to you with a roving mic. For those of you who are tuning in online, you're very welcome. You'll be able to join the discussion using the Q&A function on the Zoom, which you should see on your screen. Please feel free to send in questions and comments throughout the session as they occur to you, and we'll come to them once the High Commissioner has finished his presentation. And a reminder that today's presentation and the Q&A are both on the record. Please feel free to join the discussion on Twitter or X using the handle @IIEA and hashtag Development Matters. We're also live streaming today's discussion, so a very warm welcome to those of you who are tuning in via YouTube. I'd now like to ask Michael Gaffey, the Director General of Irish Aid, to say a few introductory words. Michael.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the IIEA, those of you here and those of you who are looking in. So every time I come to one of these lectures, I emphasize the importance for us of the Development Matters series, which allows us to bring important figures in the world of humanitarian action and development to discuss issues of the day with a wide audience. And I think we are really, really honored today to have Filippo Grandi with us. As David said, it's his second visit to this institute. He was here in 2019. The world, unfortunately, has changed quite significantly even since 2019. So we are really honored to have him with us here today. I think the esteem in which he is held here in Ireland is demonstrated by the fact that in a very short visit since yesterday afternoon, he has met the President, the Minister for Justice, the Minister for Development, the Taoiseach, and the Taoiseach. And now he has come to the IIEA. So he is incredibly welcome. And I just want to say, if any of you heard or listened back to Morning Ireland this morning, Filippo gave a really powerful interview, which placed in a very prominent position in the Morning Ireland schedule, which placed refugees at the heart of our thinking. And I think that is a really important thing to do, because in these fractured and unpredictable times, it would be very easy to forget the massive crisis of displaced people, displaced by conflict, displaced by climate change, which is a huge wound in our world, and one as some countries move for their own reasons to cut their development aid, one that can sometimes get forgotten. So I suppose I should, on behalf of the ministers, yet again state that the government, and it's very important to state this because there will be negotiations coming up very shortly, the government does not intend to cut Ireland's development assistance, and ministers will be negotiating, hopefully, to be able to increase that assistance. And finally, I would say that we took a conscious decision about 10 years ago, in 2015 or so, following the difficult period of cuts in the Irish aid programme due to the financial crisis. We took a very conscious decision in focusing where we will build up again on UNHCR because of the refugee crisis, but not only that, because of the the conviction we have that UNHCR is a good, effective organisation. And that is in large part due to its staff, but also its leadership, Filippo. So he is finishing up in the role later in the year after 2 terms. So it's great to have him here. And we just want to thank you, Filippo, for all your work and re-emphasise Ireland's support for the work of UNHCR. Thank you very much.
I'll just say a few words about Filippo's own background. I remember, Filippo, that you first came to Ireland about 50 years ago to learn English for a few weeks and see what a good job you made of it. Filippo is the 11th UN High Commissioner for Refugees. He was first elected by the General Assembly on the 1st of January 2016 for a 5-year term, and since then he has been re-elected twice. It was my own pleasure and privilege to work with Filippo while I was at the UN on the New York Declaration on Migrants and Refugees, which in turn led on to 2 global compacts, as you know, Filippo, one in relation to migrants specifically and the other in relation to refugees. So it was an enormous pleasure working with you at the time. Filippo has been engaged in refugee and humanitarian work for over 30 years in different roles. He served as the Commissioner General of UNRWA, the UN Agency for Palestine, and he's also been the Deputy Special Representative of the Secretary General for Afghanistan, and has worked with NGOs and the UNHCR in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. A more recent achievement was that last summer, Filippo was awarded, I think, the Olympic laureate. He was presented with an Olympic laureate, the 3rd person to be honored in this way, for his work in helping refugee athletes and in supporting the first ever IOC refugee team. This was a high point of the Summer Olympics last year for us. Filippo, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, David, and thanks, Michael, for your words of support. Thanks all. Thanks, Jill, for helping organize this meeting. Thanks to Noel, who's our ambassador or your ambassador to us in Geneva, who's kind enough to accompany me here. And thanks to the Institute for what you do and for having me for the 2nd time here in Dublin. I have not been back to Ireland after that visit of 2019, but we thought at UNHCR it would be very important to come back again before the end of my tenure at the end of this year. And as I have said to all the authorities that Michael has mentioned earlier, that I had the pleasure and the privilege of meeting yesterday and today, that the really one key purpose of this visit is to thank the government and the people of Ireland for the extraordinary support that they have provided to us. What Michael said about the choice that was made to support the UN, but also UNHCR has translated into very concrete support, financial support, but also political support in the sense that you can imagine moral policy support in international fora. Ireland has been loyal and strong in that, and I want to use this opportunity to say that, as I said this morning at the radio program at Morning Ireland. At the time when multilateralism is so much under attack, I think this support for multilateral institutions is particularly important. And a few words about that. You know, I was struggling a bit with what could be interesting. There's so much, and I'll be happy to answer a question, but mine, you know, I'll share a few thoughts about certain things, and then we can take it from there. And the first one is this crisis of multilateralism, or this, I actually don't think multilateralism is in crisis per se. It's been attacked increasingly in the international fora. And if you think carefully about it, yesterday the president challenged us a bit to talk about these matters, to reflect on these issues, but it is fundamentally about giving violence, giving force, I should say, legitimacy, about giving the use of force legitimacy as within countries and among countries as a way to solve problems and to address grievances at complete variance, therefore, with the UN Charter that was set out, was established to set out basic rules and means to protect everybody, weak and strong, countries, communities, and individuals. So the United Nations, the embodiment of multilateralism, has been created as a forum to solve conflicts and other global challenges by way of cooperation and not of competition, and certainly not of force, based on a set of rules of what is allowed when you disagree, because inevitably you disagree in international relations. And all of this at the moment is being questioned. You may argue that it has always been under attack or, you know, not respected. But I, in my long career, by now more than 40 years working in crisis and in humanitarian assistance, I've never seen so much space given to these attacks. I've never seen a kind of legitimization of the attacks on this system, and therefore on the use of force as an alternative to compromise. Of course, you all know very well all of this, and like I said, Ireland has been one of the, may I say, I hope I'm not being dramatic, one of the few remaining champions among states of a rules-based systems, both in terms of norms and of institutions, maybe and certainly also because of your own history in that respect. And the message that I have passed this morning to the leadership of this country, this morning and yesterday to the leadership of this country, is please remain steadfast. Even when you come under attack for maintaining those positions. You know, the Prime Minister, the Taoiseach, said something important. He said, when you are a relatively small country and you uphold these positions, it's not easy. It's not easy, and maybe, he said, we should really have a deep reflection on how we do that best. How can we even be more effective when we are a minority among states and not necessarily the great powers among states? I think that this is an important reflection. It's a matter of communication. It's a matter of alliances. It's a matter of where you bring these values forward. But my message to all of them has been, don't give it up. For those of us who are within the multilateral system and carry out and have responsibilities in that respect, that action, that message, that upholding of the whole system is of incredible value. Doesn't matter the size of the country or its political power in the bigger scheme of things. I think it is important not to give up talking and doing these things. Of course, all of this, and you know very well, and this is my second theme, is happening at a time of many crises. Of course, this trend of the use of force is also because of all these crises, but certainly is also a cause of many of these crises. Crises that take many forms today. Part of the global situation in that respect is domestic, is crisis within countries. And we see similar patterns in many of the countries in which we certainly operate. You see a loss of trust in institutions, a feeling, a very explicit feeling that institutions cannot solve and address the big problems, the economic problems, the political problems, the social issues. And this lack of trust impacts the international engagement of countries. So the domestic dynamics that we see in many places, not necessarily just in the global north, but in many other countries, impacts the willingness of the international engagement of the country. So it has a direct correlation with the international dimension of this crisis. And that, of course, has a catastrophic impact, this disengagement from the international debate, especially in respect of the challenges that we all know require international cooperation. Climate, trade, which is quite obvious now, and security in general, and why not forced displacement or migration and refugees, which is the area in which my organization works. And because of and that issue, displacement, is closely linked to the area which is perhaps most weakened by the current crisis of multilateralism, which is conflict resolution. And hence we observe a constant increase in the number and the intensity of conflicts, not only in more and more places without any of the older conflict really being resolved, but also in the ways that these conflicts, these wars are waged generally in full and sometimes even flaunted disrespect of international humanitarian law. I'm often asked why there are so many refugees and in the world, this 123 million that we talked about. And of course, you can look at many reasons, but I am persuaded that the way that conflicts are waged, which is increasingly, prioritize impacting civilians to create disarray, fear, terror, disruption, that is a primary cause for an increase in the number of people who flee, because people have no other option but to go away when they can. Gaza is a good example, as was discussed this morning on the radio, where people cannot even flee. But in most other places, people move because of the war and because of the way the wars are waged. And we see this everywhere. We see this in Ukraine. We see this in Sudan, in the Democratic Republic of Congo. We see this in the Middle East, clearly. We see it in Myanmar. We see it in Haiti. And we see it in other places as well. The list is unfortunately very long. And next point I wanted to make is actually two different sets of points, two considerations or consequences of what I have just described. One is, like I said, the scale of the forced displacement that we have to contend with. We are at a record high, 123 million. These are pretty accurate statistics. They reflect they represent the number of people that have fled because of war, violence, persecution, so that are broadly subsumed under the definition of refugees of the 1951 Convention, definition which, by the way, is still absolutely valid. How you deal with it is another matter, but the definition is valid. And 123 million is a very large number, a number that we have never recorded before. Of course, as I said, this figure grows. Refugees, people on the move, by definition, cannot be handled by one country alone. They move from one country to the other, and often through several countries. So they require international cooperation. And that's why it has become so difficult to deal with refugee issues, because that international cooperation, because of what I said earlier, is weakened. David mentioned what we worked on many years ago in New York in particular, the two compacts, in particular, in our case, the Compact on Refugees. The intuition of the Compact on Refugees was very valuable, and thank you for having been such a champion of that concept, because it was not a new set of principles. The principles exist. The rights are well defined. It was a toolbox, I always call it like this, offered to states to address this problem of forced population movements in new ways, not only in the traditional ways, government, international organization, but for example, by associating the private sector, associating civil society much more. And, I don't want to brief on the compact, but the compact is full of interesting ideas, many of which we have actually utilized since 2018 when it was established. But the compact, like all these toolboxes or tools, requires international cooperation. It can only work if states work together. And this is there is a dramatic contrast here between a proposal that we made, which we thought was pragmatic, was practical, was innovative in responding to refugee crisis, and the rhetoric of my country first, which has grown in so many areas of international cooperation, but particularly around issues of migration. My country first, to push people back, to not include, to not accept, to stigmatize migration and refugees. So that's really the dramatic situation we're now. The other consequence of the crisis of multilateralism that I want to flag is the financial crisis. And that is very, very deep. I can give you more details if you want, but it is very clear that announcement by the US administration that they would freeze all international assistance and dismantle USAID, but broader than that, freeze all of assistance, which we've been discussing with them since January, with very little resources coming from the US to the whole aid system. Remember, just UNHCR last year, 40% of our contributions came from the US. And this year, this has almost dropped to zero. So we are in a very difficult situation without notice and in a very short period of time, and in a situation in which the whole system is impacted by this decision or trend. Other countries, other significant donors have followed suit, many of them to respond to other pressures that came from the US, for example, to increase defense spending. So the choice was made to increase defense spending, but to cut other parts of public budgets, including foreign assistance, which often is the first one to be cut, is the one that has the least constituencies in any country to defend. I have been saying very clearly that, without pronouncing myself on the issue of security and defense budgets, that to increase security in a continent like Europe, for example, and to decrease foreign assistance is a strategic mistake. It's very myopic or short-sighted, and it's but that's the choice that has been made by other donors as well, and it is extremely devastating at the moment. Some of the sectors have been particularly impacted. Food security, for example, health. The health sector is, at this moment, health programs in Africa in particular have been decimated. This is largely because USAID had such an important role in supporting these programs, but also education, which has, after years of efforts to put education back into refugee program as a priority, as important as shelter or medicines or food, we are obliged, because of the focus on life-saving with few resources, to deprioritize it again. And, areas that have been defunded, partly because of the general trend towards defunding, partly because of more ideological reasons. For example, and this I find astonishing, gender-based violence programs meant to respond to gender-based violence, which are vital in today's war environment where gender-based violence is a tool of war. Because of the word gender, many of these programs have now been defunded. So this is the almost absurd situation we're in, absurd intellectually, lethal from the practical point of view. And here I want to also mention something that I've been mentioning a lot, that of course this has an impact in areas that are where defunding and decreasing aid is not only wrong, morally wrong, but also strategically very risky. And for Europe, this is certainly concerns certainly what I always called the belt of crisis around the continent: Sahel, Sudan, Yemen, Middle East, Afghanistan, you can say a little bit further away, and Ukraine. If you defund, aid has a very stabilizing factor in every country. It doesn't solve problems, but it helps stabilize problems. I am very worried, for example, that the lack of funds to respond to the Sudan emergency, probably the biggest in the world today, will mean not only grave destabilization of the region, neighboring countries like Chad, South Sudan, Ethiopia, that are all very fragile, some of them coming out of war themselves, but it will also have an effect on population movement. I've seen it already myself with my eyes in Chad, the main recipient of Sudanese refugees. Traffickers are already very active in all the border areas between Chad and Sudan, offering people relatively cheap journeys to Libya. And we already estimate 350,000 Sudanese have moved to Libya. And you know what that means for Europe. So we tell the Europeans, you're so concerned about population movements, influx of people, so you better look at this question of aid. It's not that aid automatically stops people from moving, but aid has. Aid meant not only as helping states control their borders, but aid meant as help states give opportunities to people that seek refuge on their territory. That aid has a stabilizing function. There's a lot more that I could say, but maybe I should stop here. I just wanted to add one more reflection before I close. And this is something that has come up also this morning in meetings here with the leadership. And maybe in a modest way, more modest than other tools, multilateralism is also useful to maintain the network of international relations alive when all other spaces are shut. Tomorrow night, I'll be flying to Kabul, and I'll be spending a couple of days in Afghanistan. And after that, I will be going to Iran, of all places. And the reason why I do this visit is that the Afghan refugee crisis is one of the biggest programs for UNHCR. The biggest recipient countries of Afghan refugees are Iran and Pakistan, and both are deporting Afghans at the moment for a variety of complex geopolitical and social and economic issues. So I'm trying, I'll go to help my colleagues address this issue. But, I do realize that I will be visiting countries which are cut off from the mainstream international political dialogue. So, but humanitarian work cannot be based on politics in that sense. We have to go where the needs are. And in so doing, we open channels. In the past, I remember when I was much younger, at the end of the Cold War, for example, so many times humanitarian work was used as a conduit to reopen international relations. So I'm using that as an example of the value of multilateralism that often is forgotten, and something to think about. I'll stop here. I want to thank again all of you, and I know that you are all in different ways active in these issues, and with a plea to continue to encourage your own leadership, your own government, your own institutions to remain engaged in defending multilateralism, to remain engaged in pursuing peace in difficult situations, and above all, to remain engaged to help the most vulnerable among us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Filippo. As always, a rich offering in terms of reflections on where we are at present in the multinational system and where specifically the organization you lead is positioned. Let's open up then for questions. While people are gathering their thoughts, I'll begin with one of my own, if I may. Filippo, obviously the impact of the USAID cuts has been profound. I mean, devastating is what you called it a moment ago. What does that mean in terms of revising the priorities for expenditure within UNHCR? And maybe you might say something about the implications in terms of personnel cuts, because we've read a certain amount in the newspapers about that. But I mean, obviously we're looking at the overall impact on UN agencies of these cuts and of the related or of the other cuts you referred to, notably what the UK has done. We get a sense of what each agency is trying to do to adjust to the new reality. But number one, what are or have you had to revise your priorities, what you hope to do, and what are the personnel implications? Please.
Shall I answer directly?
Exactly.
Yeah, maybe in a nutshell. I think what we're looking at, first of all, the humanitarian sector has been the first impacted, and at the moment is the most impacted, partly because the US percentage of funding in humanitarian programs has always been overwhelmingly high, whether it is refugees or food aid or children. So these are the three biggest agencies of the UN system, and health programs and so forth. So that's what needs to be kept in mind. That has meant that all the big agencies in the system, both not only UN, but also big NGOs, international NGOs, Red Cross movement, have all had to concentrate on rapidly reducing expenditure. In March or February, at the beginning of this crisis, my controller came to tell me that if we did not cut expenditure in a matter of a few months, we would end the year with a colossal deficit, something that the UN rules, financial rules, don't allow us to run. We cannot have a deficit, we cannot borrow money, so we have to spend what we get. And so we were vastly above the limit. And therefore, we had to go for programs of cut, just like most other organizations, in different percentages. I think roughly around the humanitarian system, you range from about 15% to 30 and even 40% cuts. We are in the range of 30% cuts of our personnel and even worse, of our activities. Just to give you one figure, to give you a sense, last year we distributed about $700 million globally in cash handouts. Cash is now the chief means of assistance, right? With new technology and all, it's the most effective and it reaches the most vulnerable. This year we will be barely at 200 million. from 600 million, 700 million to 250 million. So this is the real impact. Cutting positions is terrible, but it's also cutting, and especially cutting assistance. And cutting positions for an organization like ours, like was the ICRC or others, has also an important impact on people. Because remember, our mandate is humanitarian, distribute assistance, but it's also protection. It's negotiating access to territory, advising on legislation. That's an important part of our work. Without people, you cannot do it. That's why, shutting many offices, as we have to do at the moment, has a very bad impact on that particular angle of our work. The other thing that is important to say to complete a bit the picture is that, of course, in many places, this necessity to cut imposed in an unreasonable short period of time and to unprecedented an unprecedented extent was presented by many, including by many of our donors, as a necessary search for efficiencies. That's great. You have to do more with less, all this nonsense. I always said you cannot do more with less. It's against the logic, right? So I've been using this, we will do less with less, that now everybody's using. I'm very pleased, although I'm not pleased by the fact. I'm pleased by the fact that it's recognized. But that's what we ended up with. At the same time, of course, if we reduce, we want to do it in a manner that, I don't know if we can say as efficient as possible, but reducing the impact on people as much as we can. And that's about what do we prioritize, that's your other question. And I'm very sad to say that a lot of what we as an organization have done in the past few years in important sectors like education, refugee education, where very often we're the only ones who can provide that, who is interested in providing that. That is deprioritized. We simply have not enough money, and we have to keep people alive, and we have to put the money there. So life-saving sectors have been prioritized. I consider education as life-saving as others, but one has to be realistic. So what we have tried to do is two things. We have tried to pull together better the resources of the different organizations. This is what this UN 80 that the Secretary General is pursuing wants to achieve, but that's a very big program involving the whole of the UN. Where we have started working very practically is in the humanitarian sector, where we are more flexible, we're more practical, we're more agile. So I think that we will get to some positive results, not just within the UN, but working with NGOs, with the Red Cross movement, and so forth. This program called Humanitarian Reset becomes very important to try to avoid, to the extent possible, every duplication, fill every gap, and to reduce in an orderly manner that maximizes efficiency. It's a little bit contradictory, despite what people think, but that's what we're striving to do.
Thanks, Filippo. I mean, normally in a situation where one major donor cuts back drastically, as we're facing now, other like-minded countries, certain Northern European countries would come to the rescue. And I presume that right now you're getting no traction for them because they are all diverted by their defense budgets and things like that. I mean, there's no good news then in the European front. Is that right?
Few good news. You are one.
Glad
Let's say that. Ireland is one. Michael is here. He's the head of Irish Aid. Thank you very much, because we appreciate what you said earlier, that commitment remains, and a few other countries continue to be up there. The European Commission has not reduced funding, but nobody can really increase aid in a proportionate manner because it was so disproportionate before. That's part of the problem. We have been arguing, some of us have been arguing, that there are areas which Europe, and let me repeat it again, should be mindful of. That if not properly resourced, they may turn into liabilities for the European continent. One is refugee and migration work. One is probably food security, which is closely related, and the other one is health. I can see these as the main areas where we are really calling on Europe to try and find resources. I appreciate that, the priorities are elsewhere, unfortunately, defense and other sectors, but, see this, please, that's the appeal, please, Europe, see these as investments also in your security. Because your backyard, your vast backyard, this belt of crisis is about your security as well. And making those crises worse can only weaken your own security. So I know it sounds a little bit, some people say, what is he talking about? Actually, I think it's true. I've seen myself, as I said, people moving. I've seen the situation in North Africa is not good, either in Libya, instability looming again, in Tunisia, very hostile politics in respect of refugees and migrants. All of these are difficult signals for Europe that they need to be dealt with.
I think you said recently that aid is stability, and that's a sentiment we would all agree with, and it's something we should be constantly saying. Yes, please. Sorcha Pollock of the Irish Times.
I'm Sorcha Pollock from the Irish Times. Thank you very much, Commissioner. I have a few questions, so I'll just put them all together, if that's okay. Is that the best way to do it? So I'm going to start with the EU Migration Pact. There's definitely a move in Europe towards the right with a kind of a major crackdown on migration, fortifying European borders, and we've referred to that already. And asylum seeker numbers across Europe and here in Ireland have gone down in recent months. But that doesn't mean people aren't still arriving. As you've referenced, they're just being stopped on borders. So quite simply, where do these people go? Because the conflicts and the crises that are pushing them to our borders are not going away, including climate emergencies. I know I'm asking you this in your capacity as the former Commissioner General of UNRWA, but I wanted to ask about the continued blockade on aid in going into Gaza. And I know this was probably touched on this morning, but just the ongoing crisis when 6,000 trucks full of food are waiting on the border and health workers are waiting, and we're seeing an absolute humanitarian crisis, particularly among children. And on that question, journalists not being allowed into Gaza to report on what's happening. And as a result, we are getting reports that we have to believe, but we don't know if we're getting the full story still. And finally, you referenced quite a few times there the USAID cuts, the freeze on international assistance from the US, the drop from 40% to 0% in spending. But I just want to ask where, and the focus on defense spending more generally, where does that leave us as an international community in 2025? Where are we headed, in your opinion, when we are returning to this reliance on defense rather than multilateralism?
On your first question, which was actually in itself a multi-question. First of all, just to be clear, we at UNHCR have supported the pact. We know that sectors of civil society, human rights organizations have expressed concerns, but we think that under the circumstances, given the geopolitical situation, given the pressure on migration and refugees, the pact is a good attempt at a compromise. Talking about international relations, it's a good multilateral tool, if you want to call it like that. Is it perfect? No. Is it easy to apply? No, that's my main concern. It's quite complex, but we have made ourselves available and we've worked with the European Commission. And by the way, thanks Ireland for having opted in. Now in the pact, we discussed this with the Minister of Justice yesterday, and we remain available to help Ireland as it formulates the legislation that has to go with it. We think that if it is well applied, then it's only at the end of next year. I think we're still in the preparation time. It can really improve the way, through more burden sharing, through more cooperation with states, through more efficient procedures at borders. It can improve the way, it can equip Europe better to deal with flows that are much bigger than when the Dublin system was set up, which was a different concept. So I think that it is a good evolution in that respect, and we support it. Where will people come from? I also believe, and that it's very difficult to control flows just through controls. Sorry about this bad pun. But if you just increase border controls and you create a lot of obstacles, that will not stop people from moving. It may slow them down, it may change routes. These movements are like water. They go around obstacles and they move on. This is not meant to be a scary statement. It's just meant to say that the best way, controls are legitimate. If they're legitimate, they're legitimate. But what needs to be done is to offer all the states upstream along the routes opportunities for people on the move. That's what will anchor people where they are in the first country which they reach, which is often the only one they want to go to because they want to go back to their country. There's a perception that everybody wants to come to Europe. Many do, but not all. In fact, not the majority. So the opportunities is very, very important. And this is why aid is very important, because opportunities can only be provided through aid, not only to the people on the move, but to the communities hosting them, to states hosting them, et cetera, et cetera. So that's my view of how this should be managed in the future. On Gaza, what to say? I am sometimes tempted to say, when we say what's happening is unspeakable, and to stop here, because if it's unspeakable, you don't even speak about this anymore. It's so awful. And what is awful is this preventing aid from reaching people that are under the bombs, whose houses are destroyed, that are being forced to move from one part of the Gaza Strip to the other in this, unprecedented provoked displacement, if you wish. All of these, of course, are major violations of international humanitarian law, as has been said many times. I won't express myself more. UNHCR, as you know, it's not that we don't want to be involved, it's that because there is a clear division of labor with UNRWA, and we think that UNRWA is still there, is still an important actor. It's good that Ireland continues to support UNRWA, but their situation is pretty desperate. But the UN and UNRWA must continue to be involved. That's the only way for aid to reach the people in need in a legitimate manner, in a manner that is not manipulated by other interest, which is essentially military interest. So I think it's important to bear that in mind. It's very frustrating. It's very frustrating because, as you said, this is a place, or like the radio interviewer told me this morning, this is the one place where displacement or refugees cannot even occur because they cannot go out of the Gaza Strip. So it's this suffocating prison within which people are pushed from one side to the other. So very, very dramatic situation. And that's all I can say for the time being. And your last question was about funding.
Journalism.
Yeah. I find it a bit difficult for me to express my views on defense spending. This is not my job, and I can appreciate all sides of that important debate. My only point is the point I already made. I want to repeat it again, is to put more money into defense spending at the expense of foreign assistance. Frankly, foreign assistance is very small compared to defense spending. Is it really a very strategic saving to cut aid, as some countries are doing, in order to boost defense spending? Is it really necessary? I leave this to finance ministers, but I hope that they will reflect on the impact that these cuts are having on people, fundamentally, and I think we do have a moral responsibility there, but also on the security of Europe.
Thank you, Filippo. I'll come to Michael Doyle in a moment, but I just want to bring in a couple of questions from online. One is from Caoimhe de Barra, who's the head of strategic engagement with the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission. Could the High Commissioner comment on the importance of ensuring that the highest standards of human rights protection are embedded in national legislation giving effect to the Migration Pact? This will ensure that Ireland's commitment to promotion and protection of human rights internationally is mirrored domestically. So this is more the national perspective in terms of this legislation.
Yeah, well, what can I say?
Yeah.
Yes, of course. And we also appreciate that in every country, meeting these very high standards is complex, generates other challenges, especially in a situation in which, well, this year there's a bit less people arriving, but last year was a peak for Ireland. And as we discussed with the government yesterday, it's very clear that Ireland, a little bit later than other countries in Europe, has had to face the same challenge to deal with an influx much bigger than before, including of asylum seekers, with tools that were designed for much smaller arrivals. So I think that the standards have to be maintained and met for sure, but we also have to recognize that these systems have to be adapted to a different situation, in which, by the way, many people use the asylum channel for other purposes. We know that many of the people arriving in Europe today will not be recognized as refugees. And they use the asylum channel for migration purposes. We still maintain that distinction, because the migration channels are not sufficiently broad and well regulated. You know, many times I remember the former commissioner in humanitarian aid and former foreign minister of my country, Emma Bonino, used to say, the real challenge is not the refugees, we all agree on their rights, it's the migrants for which a right system is much more loose and less built, as became clear during the formulation of the two compacts. So I think it's important to open up migration possibilities so that people can legally move as migrants to countries that actually need them, like in Europe, and they don't weigh in and obstruct the asylum channel, taking away credibility and capacity from that channel, which must be kept for the people that really flee from violence, from human rights abuses, and so forth. I don't know if it's clear, but I think that this is the direction in which we need to move.
Thanks, Filippo. A question from Nora Owen, who is a former Minister for Justice and also an IIEA board member. She mentions that this morning the Minister for Justice, whom you've met, discussed the Dublin regulation, which he said it has not been working properly, and it is to be replaced, as you know, by the Asylum and Migration Management Regulation. Do you consider that these changes will help the position of refugees once they're implemented?
If the pact, which is behind this, and the regulations are implemented correctly, and we are in the process of working with all EU member states and the European Commission on this, then I think, yes, it will help. It will never solve all the problems. It will still require cooperation between European countries, which can be a challenge in the present geopolitical context, but I think that if all this happens, it can help. Yes, that's why we are in favor of the pact.
Great. Michael Doyle.
Thank you. Yeah. Michael Doyle, former EU official, and we met towards the end of your mandate with UNRWA when I was dealing with an EU funding stream that supported UNRWA at the time. My question today, though, I want to focus on a particular context, one of those forgotten ones, although you referred to it this morning, Myanmar and the Rohingya, and the convener of a European group of friends of Myanmar, so hence my specific interest in it. On the 30th of September, we will have the UN high-level conference convened by the President of the General Assembly on the situation of Rohingya, and as was called for by Mohammed Yunus, interim leader of Bangladesh. What are, from a UNHCR perspective, what are your hopes and realistic expectations for what can come from that conference in the current context in the world and in the situation in Bangladesh and in Myanmar? And I know you were there in, I think, March of this year. And it's not just Rohingya in Bangladesh, but also elsewhere in Asia and around the world.
Yeah, of course. There are two issues, or it's like you have a bigger sphere of conflict in Myanmar, generalized conflict between the federal de facto authorities and the different armies of the different groups. And that in itself, leave alone the Rohingya for a moment, that in itself is a catastrophic problem at the moment, because it is causing deaths daily, massive displacement within the country, and a little bit of outflows into neighboring countries, Thailand, India, and so forth. And efforts so far to try to at least improve the delivery of humanitarian assistance to the population in need have had very limited success. The de facto authorities have not been very forthcoming, although we are still present together with the rest of the UN and aid system in Myanmar, and we are trying to continue to occupy the space that is given to us in terms of delivering aid to the people in need. Of course, what is the two biggest challenges there are, one, no significant peacemaking effort so far. We know that the situation militarily has gone a little bit against the central authorities, so the other groups have gained more space, but there is no resolution to the conflict, even on the military point of view. And the second one is the lack of funding, because like everywhere else, now even the little that we could do is hampered by lack of funding. So not a very good perspective. And then within that Myanmar challenge, you have the Rohingya challenge, which is very specific because it comes from before this crisis. It is the result of decades of discrimination, as we all know, by the federal authorities and by the local non-Rohingya communities against the Rohingya, which caused the catastrophic outflow, violence and outflow in 2017. The interesting thing is that I visit very regularly Bangladesh, and the Rohingya will always tell you, we still want to go back, in spite of everything. But they don't want to go back at all costs. They want to go back with some guarantees that their rights will be respected. I don't see this happening anytime soon, not in the context of the broader Myanmar crisis. By the way, as you know very well, that part where the Rohingya come from now has been also affected by the other conflict, because an ethnic group, not Rohingya, is fighting against the government even in that area. So you have a three-way tension and conflict, very, very complicated. So I think the conference is a good attempt by Bangladesh, essentially by Professor Yunus, to try to bring focus back on this issue and hopefully in a broader way on the crisis in Myanmar. I'll tell you very honestly, I remember in the years after 2017, when Aung San Suu Kyi was still in power in Myanmar, there was in the Security Council, for example, regular debates on that. And we were always called to brief on the humanitarian situation. I feel that a lot of that attention has slipped away. Even when the earthquake struck last year, which should have been an opportunity for humanitarian assistance to go in, on the one hand, the military authorities on the ground didn't help very much. On the other, the international response was very limited. So this is one of the most neglected crises at the moment. Let's hope that the conference is an opportunity. We are actively cooperating in organizing it, and let's hope that it can give some results.
Thanks, Filippo. Yes, please.
Thanks. My name is Rachel Nikelliker. I'm Director of Strategy at Concern. First, Commissioner, thank you for your service. It's exceptional, and your advocacy also. My question is, and I'm glad that you mentioned the constituency, and one of the things that we do is work with schools in Ireland to build that constituency, build empathy and knowledge, with schools in Ireland, and also our work in multiple countries, the countries that you mentioned. My question is, with UNGA in mind, are we doing enough to articulate not just the impact now of the aid cuts, but the impact in 2026, when we're going to see the impact of cuts to reproductive health, cuts to nutrition? We're already seeing the level of malnutrition rising. And when you take 59 billion of humanitarian assistance out of the system, the impact that is going to have in the future. So what more can we do collectively with UNGA in mind? Thanks.
Yours is such an important question, but let me start by thanking Concern. Throughout my 40 plus years, you have been everywhere, a great partner wherever I was, and to UNHCR in particular. And it's a great opportunity for me to thank you for the work of a great humanitarian organization, really. On your question, I don't think we're doing enough. My strong plea to all my colleagues in the aid system, and this is really among ourselves, has been, let's be much more strategic, accurate in terms of data, and unanimous. Three things: strategic, data-based, and unanimous in putting out a message on impact. Because that's the only message that goes beyond politics and reaches public opinions in donor countries. And I think we need to be not unnecessarily dramatic. Actually, there's no need to be unnecessarily dramatic. It's dramatic enough as it is. But I think that this is a strong appeal. So all this discussion on efficiencies working together, that is largely not large, it's driven by all of us, but pushed by donors very much, and understandably. I think that on our side, we must have synergies in advocacy, in talking about this impact, in showing what it means in loss of lives, loss of livelihoods, loss of how can I say, confidence in them, in the people themselves. I think the impact on reproductive health is catastrophic from all points of view: health, mental health, social stigma, and so forth. That's an area where we really had made progress and invested a lot, a bit like education. And I think that this is one of the most threatened. When donors, non-US donors, tell me we cannot substitute the US, to some of them I said, at least look at these segments of aid that were strongly supported by the US before. And we're not talking about trillions of dollars, right? These are very targeted and cost-effective programs. With little, you can achieve a lot in terms of healthcare, in terms of mental health care, in terms of resettling, in our case, refugee women who suffered violence, to safer places where they can be cared for. All of this at the moment is at great risk. And I think we need to be more, but we cannot do it, of course, let's also be honest. The instinct of many of us is to go to the media and say it. If we did it together, more together, I think we would be stronger. So it's a battle I'm waging within my own organization and in the aid system, and I'll continue to do that.
Filippo, we have time, I think, for just one final question about Syria, and it's from Mariam Assad. She says that the change of the context in Syria following the fall of the Assad regime has led to new opportunities and new hope for return. But we know Syria is still not safe for wide-scale returns. The Refugee Convention clearly states what involuntary return means. However, voluntary return and the legal conditions related to it have yet to be adopted in hard law. How can we support and advocate for these principles in today's difficult political context?
Let me make one premise here. This is an important issue. Of course, I agree that the return of refugees has to be voluntary. That's very clear. That's a fundamental principle for us. However, whether to return or not voluntarily is not for us to decide. I think there is sometimes a misperception. Oh, UNHCR said people should not return. We never say that. We say, don't push people back. But if people choose to go back, they need to be supported, and nobody should second guess their choice. I say this why? Because Syria is a very good case in point. Syria emerged from this terrible decades of dictatorship in December. We are in July, 7-8 months between the internally displaced people that have returned since the 8th of December and those that have returned from neighboring countries. We are now at more than 2 million. That's not a small figure. These are people that have voted with their feet for the future, putting some trust in the future of their country. There may be other reasons why they went back. Many of them may have been very much opponents of Assad and therefore found a space to go back. Go back to retrieve their property. There are many reasons, but these people need support. And I go further than that. It's not just the returnees that need support. The country needs support to get back on its feet so that then conditions become really conducive for a bigger number of people to return, because there's still millions of Syrians abroad and millions displaced inside. And I appreciate, the lifting of sanctions was a good decision. And the
stated expression of support of many European countries, of the European institution, very good. Now we need to put substance where the intentions are stated. And it takes resources to rebuild the country. First, I think security sector. This is not my sector, but this is fundamental. You must have seen, some of you, what happened last night, quite catastrophic. A conflict in the south of the country between Druze and Bedouins, bombing by the Israelis in alleged defense of the Druze, intervention of the Syrian new authorities, a mess, in other words. But unless we invest, we help these authorities, fragile as they are, unprepared in part as they are, as if we don't help them get their act together and lead the country in a good direction, it will soon go into the wrong direction. And like many observers, much more expert observers than me, say about the situation, if the current dispensation, which is very fragile, collapses because of lack of support, the result could be worse than what we saw under Assad. So I think there's a warning there. And the people that went back, to talk from our lens, will move again. And when they move again, it will be very difficult to bring them back. And by the way, they will be so unwelcome in the region, which is so tired of refugee flows. So very bad scenario if there is no investments in Syria now. Investment by the European countries, by the US, I still hope, and by the Gulf countries. These are the three big cluster of supporters that need to coordinate a more robust support to Syria to bring it back to normality, if you wish.
Filippo, we've come to the end, I think. Thank you very, very much on behalf of the Institute's audience, both here in the room and online. As always, you've been extremely willing to respond openly and frankly to the questions we put. You can see that we count UNHCR as an extremely important partner, but your own personal reputation in Ireland is very high, and that is evident in the program arranged for the last few days. So thank you once again, Filippo, for coming. It was terrific, fascinating presentation initially, and also your responses in the discussion. I certainly learned a huge amount, and we wish you every success in dealing with the current challenges facing the organization, and indeed in your own future when your term comes to an end.
Thank you.